Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. So today, we will continue Sophie's world. The natural philosophers. The earliest Greek philosophers are sometimes called natural philosophers because they were mainly concerned with the natural world and its processes. We have already asked ourselves where everything comes from. Nowadays, a lot of people imagine that at some time something must have come from nothing. This idea was not so widespread among the Greeks. For one reason or another, they assumed that something had always existed. How everything could come from nothing was therefore not the all-important question. On the other hand, the Greeks marveled at how live fish could come from water, and huge trees and brilliantly colored flowers could come from the dead earth. Not to mention how a baby could come from its mother's womb. The philosophers observed with their own eyes that nature was in a constant state of transformation. But how could such transformations occur? How could something change from being substance to being a living thing? For example, all the earliest philosophers shared the belief that there had to be a certain basic substance at the root of all change. How they arrived at this idea is hard to say. We only know that the notion gradually evolved that there must be a basic substance that was the hidden cause of all changes in nature. There had to be something that all things came from and returned to. For us, the most interesting part is actually not what solutions these earliest philosophers arrived at, but which questions they asked and what type of answer they were looking for. We are more interested in how they thought than in exactly what they thought. We know that they posed questions relating to the transformations they could observe in the physical world. They were looking for the underlying laws of nature. They wanted to understand what was happening around them without having to turn to the ancient myths. And most important, they wanted to understand the actual processes by studying nature itself. This was quite different from explaining thunder and lightning or winter and spring by telling stories about the gods. So philosophy gradually liberated itself from religion. We could say that the natural philosophers took the first step in the direction of scientific reasoning, thereby becoming the precursors of what was to become science. Only fragments have survived of what the natural philosophers said and wrote. What little we know is found in the writings of Aristotle, who lived 2 centuries later. He refers only to the conclusions the philosophers reached. So we do not always know by what paths they reached these conclusions. But what we do know enables us to establish that the earliest Greek philosophers' project concerned the question of a basic constituent substance and the changes in nature. 3 philosophers from Miletus. The first philosopher we know of is Thales, who came from Miletus, a Greek colony in Asia Minor. He traveled in many countries, including Egypt, where he is said to have calculated the height of a pyramid by measuring its shadow at the precise moment when the length of his own shadow was equal to his height. He is also said to have accurately predicted a solar eclipse in the year 585 BC. Thales thought that the source of all things was water. We do not know exactly what he meant by that. He may have believed that all life originated from water, and that all life returns to water again when it dissolves. During his travels in Egypt, he must have observed how the crops began to grow as soon as the floods of the Nile receded from the land areas in the Nile Delta. Perhaps he also noticed that frogs and worms appeared wherever it had just been raining. It is likely that Thales thought about the way water turns to ice or vapor, and then turns back into water again. Thales is also supposed to have said that all things are full of gods. What he meant by that we can only surmise. Perhaps, seeing how the black earth was the source of everything from flowers and crops to insects and cockroaches, he imagined that the earth was filled with tiny invisible life germs. One thing is certain, he was not talking about Homer's gods. The next philosopher we hear of is Anaximander, who also lived in Miletus at about the same time as Thales. He thought that our world was only one of a myriad of worlds that evolve and dissolve in something he called the boundless. It is not so easy to explain what he meant by the boundless, but it seems clear that he was not thinking of a known substance in the way that Thales had envisaged. Perhaps he meant that the substance which is the source of all things had to be something other than the things created. Because all created things are limited, that which comes before and after them must be boundless. It is clear that this basic stuff could not be anything as ordinary as water. A third philosopher from Miletus was Anaximenes, c. 570–526 BC. He thought that the source of all things must be air or vapor. Anaximenes was of course familiar with Thales' theory of water. But where does water come from? Anaximenes thought that water was condensed air. We observe that when it rains, water is pressed from the air. When water is pressed even more, it becomes earth, he thought. He may have seen how earth and sand were pressed out of melting ice. He also thought that fire was rarefied air. According to Anaximenes, air was therefore the origin of earth, water, and fire. It is not a far cry from water to the fruit of the earth. Perhaps Anaximenes thought that earth, air, and fire were all necessary to the creation of life, but that the source of all things was air or vapor. So, like Thales, he thought that there must be an underlying substance that is the source of all natural change. Nothing can come from nothing. These three Milesian philosophers all believed in the existence of a single basic substance as the source of all things. But how could one substance suddenly change into something else? We can call this the problem of change. From about 500 BC, there was a group of philosophers in the Greek colony of Aelia in southern Italy. These Eleatics were interested in this question. The most important of these philosophers was Parmenides, c. 540–480 BC. Parmenides thought that everything that exists had always existed. This idea was not alien to the Greeks. They took it more or less for granted that everything that existed in the world was everlasting. Nothing can come out of nothing, thought Parmenides. And nothing that exists can become nothing. But Parmenides took the idea further. He thought that there was no such thing as actual change. Nothing could become anything other than it was. Parmenides realized, of course, that nature is in a constant state of flux. He perceived with his senses that things changed. But he could not equate this with what his reason told him. When forced to choose between relying either on his senses or his reason, he chose reason. You know the expression, "I'll believe it when I see it." But Parmenides didn't even believe things when he saw them. He believed that our senses give us an incorrect picture of the world, a picture that does not tally with our reason. As a philosopher, he saw it as his task to expose all forms of perceptual illusion. This unshakable faith in human reason is called rationalism. A rationalist is someone who believes that human reason is the primary source of our knowledge of the world. All things flow. A contemporary of Parmenides was Herodotus, c. 540–480 BC, who was from Ephesus in Asia Minor. He thought that constant change, or flow, was in fact the most basic characteristic of nature. We could perhaps say that Heraclitus had more faith in what he could perceive than Parmenides did. Everything flows, said Heraclitus. Everything is in constant flux and movement, nothing is abiding. Therefore we cannot step twice into the same river. When I step into the river for the second time, neither I nor the river are the same. Heraclitus pointed out that the world is characterized by opposites. If we were never ill, we would not know what it was to be well. If we never knew hunger, we would take no pleasure in being full. If there were never any war, we would not appreciate peace. And if there were no winter, we would never see the spring. Both good and bad have their inevitable place in the order of things. Heraclitus believed, without this constant interplay of opposites the world would cease to exist. God is day and night, winter and summer, war and peace, hunger and satiety, he said. He used the term God, but he was clearly not referring to the gods of the mythology. To Heraclitus, God, or the deity, was something that embraced the whole world. Indeed, God can be seen most clearly in the constant transformations and contrasts of nature. Instead of the term God, Heraclitus often used the Greek word logos, meaning reason. Although we humans do not always think alike or have the same degree of reason, Heraclitus believed that there must be a kind of universal reason guiding everything that happens in nature. This universal reason or universal law is something common to us all, and something that everybody is guided by. And yet most people live by their individual reason, thought Heraclitus. In general, he despised his fellow beings. The opinions of most people, he said, are like the playthings of infants. So in the midst of all nature's constant flux and opposites, Heraclitus saw an entity or oneness. This something, which was the source of everything, he called God or logos. For basic elements. In one way, Parmenides and Heraclitus were the direct opposite of each other. Parmenides' reason made it clear that nothing could change. Which of them was right? Should we let reason dictate or should we rely on our senses? Parmenides and Heraclitus both say two things. Parmenides says A. That nothing can change, and B. That our sensory perceptions must therefore be unreliable. Heraclitus, on the other hand, says A. That everything changes, all things flow, and B. That our sensory perceptions are reliable. Philosophers could hardly disagree more than that. But who was right? It fell to Empedocles, c. 490 to 430 BC, from Sicily, to lead the way out of the tangle they had gotten themselves into. He thought they were both right in one of their assertions, but wrong in the other. Empedocles found that the cause of their basic disagreement was that both philosophers had assumed the presence of only one element. If this were true, the gap between what reason dictates and what we can see with our own eyes would be unbridgeable. Water obviously cannot turn into a fish or a butterfly. In fact, water cannot change. Pure water will continue to be pure water. So Parmenides was right in holding that nothing changes. But at the same time, Empedocles agreed with Heraclitus that we must trust the evidence of our senses. We must believe what we see, and what we see is precisely that nature changes. Empedocles concluded that it was the idea of a single basic substance that had to be rejected. Neither water nor air alone can change into a rosebush or a butterfly. The source of nature cannot possibly be one single element. Empedocles believed that all in all, nature consisted of four elements, or roots as he termed them. These four roots were earth, air, fire, and wafer. All natural processes were due to the coming together and separating of these four elements. For all things were a mixture of earth, air, fire, and water, but in varying proportions. When a flower or an animal dies, he said, the four elements separate again. We can register these changes with the naked eye. But earth and air, fire and water remain everlasting, untouched by all the compounds of which they are part. So it is not correct to say that everything changes. Basically, nothing changes. What happens is that the four elements are combined and separated, only to be combined again. We can make a comparison to painting. If a painter only has one color, red, for instance, he cannot paint green trees. But if he has yellow, red, blue, and black, he can paint in hundreds of different colors because he can mix them in varying proportions. An example from the kitchen illustrates the same thing. If I only have flour, I have to be a wizard to bake a cake. But if I have eggs, flour, milk, and sugar, then I can make any number of different cakes. It was not purely by chance that Empedocles chose earth, air, fire, and water as nature's roots. Other philosophers before him had tried to show that the primordial substance had to be either water, air, or fire. Thales and Anaximenes had pointed out that both water and air were essential elements in the physical world. The Greeks believed that fire was also essential. They observed, for example, the importance of the sun to all living things, and they also knew that both animals and humans have body heat. Empedocles might have watched a piece of wood burning. Something disintegrates. We hear it crackle and splutter. That is water. Something goes up in smoke. That is air. The fire we can see. Something also remains when the fire is extinguished. That is the ashes, or earth. After Empedocles' clarification of nature's transformations as the combination and dissolution of the four roots, something still remained to be explained. What makes these elements combine so that new life can occur? And what makes the mixture of, say, a flower dissolve again? Empedocles believed that there were two different forces at work in nature. He called them love and strife. Love binds things together, and strife separates them. He distinguishes between substance and force. This is worth noting. Even today, scientists distinguish between elements and natural forces. Modern science holds that all natural processes can be explained as the interaction between different elements and various natural forces. Empedocles also raised the question of what happens when we perceive something. How can I see a flower, for example? What is it that happens? Have you ever thought about it, Sophie? Empedocles believed that the eyes consist of earth, air, fire, and water, just like everything else in nature. So the earth in my eye perceives what is of the earth in my surroundings, the air perceives what is of the air, the fire perceives what is of fire, and the water what is of water. Had my eyes lacked any of the four substances, I would not have seen all of nature. Something of everything in everything. Anaxagoras, 500 to 428 BC, was another philosopher who could not agree that one particular basic substance, water, for instance, might be transformed into everything we see in the natural world. Nor could he accept that earth, air, fire, and water can be transformed into blood and bone. Anaxagoras held that nature is built up of an infinite number of minute particles invisible to the eye. Moreover, everything can be divided into even smaller parts, but even in the minutest parts, there are fragments of all other things. If skin and bone are not a transformation of something else, there must also be skin and bone, he thought, in the milk we drink and the food we eat. A couple of present-day examples can perhaps illustrate Anaxagoras' line of thinking. Modern laser technology can produce so-called holograms. If one of these holograms depicts a car, for example, and the hologram is fragmented, we will see a picture of the whole car even though we only have the part of the hologram that showed the bumper. This is because the whole subject is present in every tiny part. In a sense, our bodies are built up in the same way. If I loosen a skin cell from my finger, the nucleus will contain not only the characteristics of my skin. The same cell will also reveal what kind of eyes I have, the color of my hair, the number and type of my fingers, and so on. Every cell of the human body carries a blueprint of the way all the other cells are constructed. So there is something of everything in every single cell. The whole exists in each tiny part. Anaxagoras called these minuscule particles which have something of everything in them seeds. Remember that Empedocles thought that it was love that joined the elements together in whole bodies. Anaxagoras also imagined order as a kind of force, creating animals and humans, flowers and trees. He called this force mind or intelligence, nous. Anaxagoras is also interesting because he was the first philosopher we hear of in Athens. He was from Asia Minor, but he moved to Athens at the age of 40. He was later accused of atheism and was ultimately forced to leave the city. Among other things, he said that the sun was not a god but a red-hot stone, bigger than the entire Peloponnesian peninsula. Anaxagoras was generally very interested in astronomy. He believed that all heavenly bodies were made of the same substance as Earth. He reached this conclusion after studying a meteorite. This gave him the idea that there could be human life on other planets. He also pointed out that the moon has no light of its own, its light comes from Earth, he said. He thought up an explanation for solar eclipses as well. P.S. Thank you for your attention, Sophie. It is not unlikely that you will need to read this chapter 2 or 3 times before you understand it all. But understanding will always require some effort. You probably wouldn't admire a friend who was good at everything if it cost her no effort. The best solution to the question of basic substance and the transformations in nature must wait until tomorrow, when you will meet Democritus. I'll say no more. Sophie sat in the den looking out into the garden through a little hole in the dense thicket. She had to try and sort out her thoughts after all she had read. It was as clear as daylight that plain water could never turn into anything other than ice or steam. Water couldn't even turn into a watermelon, because even watermelons consisted of more than just water. But she was only sure of that because that's what she had learned. Would she be absolutely certain, for example, that ice was only water if that wasn't what she had learned? At least, she would have to have studied very closely how water froze to ice and melted again. Sophie tried once again to use her own common sense, and not to think about what she had learned from others. Sophie was not sure whether she really believed that the source of everything actually was earth, air, fire, and water. But after all, what did that matter? In principle, Empedocles was right. The only way we can accept the transformations we can see with our own eyes, without losing our reason, is to admit the existence of more than one single basic substance. Sophie found philosophy doubly exciting because she was able to follow all the ideas by using her own common sense, without having to remember everything she had learned at school. She decided that philosophy was not something you can learn. But perhaps you can learn to think philosophically. Democritus. The most ingenious toy in the world. Sophie put all the typed pages from the unknown philosopher back into the cookie tin and put the lid on it. She crawled out of the den and stood for a while. Looking across the garden, she thought about what happened yesterday. Her mother had teased her about the love letter again at breakfast this morning. She walked quickly over to the mailbox to prevent the same thing from happening today. Getting a love letter 2 days in a row would be doubly embarrassing. There was another little white envelope. Sophie began to discern a pattern in the deliveries. Every afternoon she would find a big brown envelope. While she read the contents, the philosopher would sneak up to the mailbox with another little white envelope. So now Sophie would be able to find out who he was. If it was a he, she had a good view of the mailbox from her room. If she stood at the window she would see the mysterious philosopher. White envelopes don't just appear out of thin air. Sophie decided to keep a careful watch the following day. Tomorrow was Friday, and she would have the whole weekend ahead of her. She went up to her room and opened the envelope. There was only one question today, but it was even dumber than the previous 3. Why is Lego the most ingenious toy in the world? For a start, Sophie was not at all sure she agreed that it was. It was years since she had played with the little plastic blocks. Moreover, she could not for the life of her see what Lego could possibly have to do with philosophy. But she was a dutiful student. Rummaging on the top shelf of her closet, she found a bag full of Lego blocks of all shapes and sizes. For the first time in ages, she began to build with them. As she worked, some ideas began to occur to her about the blocks. They are easy to assemble, she thought. Even though they are all different, they all fit together. They are also unbreakable. She couldn't ever remember having seen a broken Lego block. All her blocks looked as bright and new as the day they were bought, many years ago. The best thing about them was that with Lego, she could construct any kind of object. And then she could separate the blocks and construct something new. What more could one ask of a toy? Sophie decided that Lego really could be called the most ingenious toy in the world. But what it had to do with philosophy was beyond her. She had nearly finished constructing a big doll's house. Much as she hated to admit it, she hadn't had as much fun in ages. Why did people quit playing when they grew up? When her mother got home and saw what Sophie had been doing, she blurted out, "What fun! I'm so glad you're not too grown up to play." "I'm not playing," Sophie retorted indignantly. "I'm doing a very complicated philosophical experiment." Her mother sighed deeply. She was probably thinking about the white rabbit and the top hat. When Sophie got home from school, the following day, there were several more pages for her in a big brown envelope. She took them upstairs to her room. She could not wait to read them, but she had to keep her eye on the mailbox at the same time. The atom theory. "Here I am again, Sophie. Today you are going to hear about the last of the great natural philosophers. His name is Democritus, c. 460 to 370 BC, and he was from the little town of Abdera on the northern Aegean coast." If you were able to answer the question about Lego blocks without difficulty, you should have no problem understanding what this philosopher's project was. Democritus agreed with his predecessors that transformations in nature could not be due to the fact that anything actually changed. He therefore assumed that everything was built up of tiny invisible blocks, each of which was eternal and immutable. Democritus called these smallest units atoms. The word atom means uncuttable. For Democritus, it was all important to establish that the constituent parts that everything else was composed of could not be divided indefinitely into smaller parts. If this were possible, they could not be used as blocks. If atoms could eternally be broken down into ever smaller parts, nature would begin to dissolve like constantly diluted soup. Moreover, nature's blocks had to be eternal, because nothing can come from nothing. In this, he agreed with Parmenides and the Eleatics. Also, he believed that all atoms were firm and solid. But they could not all be the same. If all atoms were identical, there would still be no satisfactory explanation of how they could combine to form everything from poppies and olive trees to goatskin and human hair. Democritus believed that nature consisted of an unlimited number and variety of atoms. Some were round and smooth, others were irregular and jagged. And precisely because they were so different, they could join together into all kinds of different bodies. But however infinite they might be in number and shape, they were all eternal, immutable, and indivisible. When a body, a tree or an animal, for instance, died and disintegrated, the atoms dispersed and could be used again in new bodies. Atoms moved around in space, but because they had hooks and barbs, they could join together to form all the things we see around us. So now you see what I meant about Lego blocks. they have more or less the same properties as those which Democritus ascribed to atoms. And that is what makes them so much fun to build with. They are first and foremost indivisible. Then they have different shapes and sizes. They are solid and impermeable. They also have hooks and barbs so that they can be connected to form every conceivable figure. These connections can later be broken again so that new figures can be constructed from the same blocks. The fact that they can be used over and over is what has made Lego so popular. Each single Lego block can be part of a truck one day and part of a castle the day after. We could also say that Lego blocks are eternal. Children of today can play with the same blocks their parents played with when they were little. We can form things out of clay too, but clay cannot be used over and over, because it can be broken up into smaller and smaller pieces. These tiny pieces can never be joined together again to make something else. Today we can establish that Democritus' atom theory was more or less correct. Nature really is built up of different atoms that join and separate. Again, a hydrogen atom in a cell at the end of my nose was once part of an elephant's trunk. A carbon atom in my cardiac muscle was once in the tail of a dinosaur. In our own time, however, scientists have discovered that atoms can be broken into smaller elemental particles. We call these elemental particles protons, neutrons, and electrons. These will possibly someday be broken into even lesser particles. But physicists agree that somewhere along the line, there has to be a limit. There has to be a minimal part of which nature consists. Democritus did not have access to modern electronic apparatus. His only proper equipment was his mind. But reason left him no real choice. Once it is accepted that nothing can change, that nothing can come out of nothing, and that nothing is ever lost, then nature must consist of infinitesimal blocks that can join and separate again. Democritus did not believe in any force or soul that could intervene in natural processes. The only things that existed, he believed, were atoms and the void. Since he believed in nothing but material things, we call him a materialist. According to Democritus, there is no conscious design in the movement of atoms. In nature, everything happens quite mechanically. This does not mean that everything happens randomly, for everything obeys the inevitable laws of necessity. Everything that happens has a natural cause, cause that is inherent in the thing itself. Democritus once said that he would rather discover a new cause of nature than be the king of Persia. The atom theory also explains our sense perception, thought Democritus. When we sense something, it is due to the movement of atoms in space. When I see the moon, it is because moon atoms penetrate my eye. But what about the soul, then? Surely that could not consist of atoms. Of material things? Indeed it could. Democritus believed that the soul was made up of special round, smooth soul atoms. When a human being died, the soul atoms flew in all directions, and could then become part of a new soul formation. This meant that human beings had no immortal soul, another belief that many people share today. They believe, like Democritus, that soul is connected with brain, and that we cannot have any form of consciousness once the brain disintegrates. Democritus's atom theory marked the end of Greek natural philosophy. For the time being, he agreed with Heraclitus that everything in nature flowed, since storms come and go. But behind everything that flowed there were some eternal and immutable things that did not flow. Democritus called them atoms. During her reading, Sophie glanced out of the window several times to see whether her mysterious correspondent had turned up at the mailbox. Now she just sat staring down the road, thinking about what she had read. She felt that Democritus's ideas had been so simple and yet so ingenious. He had discovered the real solution to the problem of basic substance and transformation. This problem had been so complicated that philosophers had gone around puzzling over it for generations. And in the end, Democritus had solved it on his own by using his common sense. Sophie could hardly help smiling. It had to be true that nature was built up of small parts that never changed. At the same time, Heraclitus was obviously right in thinking that all forms in nature flow. Because everybody dies, animals die, even a mountain range slowly disintegrates. The point was that the mountain range is made up of tiny indivisible parts that never break up. At the same time, Democritus had raised some new questions. For example, he had said that everything happened mechanically. He did not accept that there was any spiritual force in life, unlike Empedocles and Anaxagoras. Democritus also believed that man had no immortal soul. Could she be sure of that? She didn't know. But then she had only just begun the philosophy course. So thank you for watching. See you in the next part. Till then, subscribe, like the video.